Number 1. The U.S.S. Guitarro. A nuclear attack submarine is one of the most complex machines ever built. It is easy to imagine one lost to a torpedo, a storm, or the crushing dark of the deep. It is much harder to imagine one drowning quietly at its own pier in calm harbor water with no enemy in sight. That is exactly what happened to the Guitarro. She was a brand new Sturgeon-class boat still under construction at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, only about 9 months from joining the fleet. On the 15th of May, 1969, she sank at her berth. The cause was not a broken part. It was two work crews doing the same kind of job at the same time, and neither one telling the other. At around 1600, a team calibrating instruments added roughly 5 tons of water to the trim tanks at the stern. About half an hour later, a second team, with no idea the first had done anything, began flooding the tanks at the bow to bring the boat level to within half a degree of trim. The bow slowly rode lower and lower through the evening. Reserve buoyancy is the small margin of extra flotation that keeps a submarine on the surface, and that margin was quietly being spent. At about 20:30, the boat suddenly dipped hard at the nose, and water began pouring in through the hatches that stood open for construction. The crew scrambled to seal them, but cables and hoses ran through every opening, and the hatches would not close over them. Water flooded down into the hull, and Guitarro settled onto the bottom of the harbor with her sail awash. She was refloated 3 days later. The repairs cost somewhere between $15.2 and $21.8 million and delayed her commissioning by about 32 months. A congressional inquiry that followed was brutal about the shipyard's procedures. The mainstream view calls it plain negligence. Others frame it as a systemic breakdown in communication that any opened-up hull invites. Either way, a few tons of water and 2 silent crews nearly cost the Navy a nuclear submarine before it ever left the pier. Much of the flooding came down through the torpedo loading hatch, one of the largest openings in the boat, held wide for the work. Warnings about the ship's precarious condition that evening were noted and not acted upon in time. The board that investigated, drawn from Congress, was scathing about a shipyard where 2 teams could flood the same submarine without knowing the other existed. Guitarro was eventually raised, repaired, and commissioned in 1972, going on to serve until 1992. To this day, she is taught in the Navy as a case study in watertight integrity, the boat the press called the submarine that sank itself, which raises an uncomfortable question about how thin that margin of safety really is. Number 2. The U.S.S. Guardfish. Some malfunctions announce themselves with fire or flooding. The worst ones are silent and invisible. On the 21st of May, 1973, the Guardfish, a nuclear attack boat, was running submerged about 370 miles southwest of Puget Sound in Washington state. Deep inside her, a leak opened in the primary reactor coolant system. That system carries water under enormous pressure and heat directly past the reactor core, which makes the water itself radioactive. When the leak sprayed, it filled the reactor compartment with radioactive steam. 5 crew members working in or near that space were contaminated. Here is what makes this kind of failure so frightening. Radiation cannot be seen, smelled, or felt. The men would not have known the invisible dose they were taking except through the boat's instruments and their own dosimeters. And a submarine cannot simply open a window. To clear that contamination, the crew had to bring the boat to the surface and ventilate the affected spaces to the open air. They decontaminated the exposed sailors, isolated the leak, and repaired it themselves without evacuating and without any reported release into the ocean. It is important to separate this from a meltdown. The reactor core was not destroyed. This was a contained coolant leak, not core damage. But a loss of coolant is still one of the most serious things that can happen to a reactor because the coolant is what carries heat away from the core. Lose enough of it, and the reactor can overheat or be forced to shut down, which on a submarine also means losing propulsion. Investigators have generally pointed to a failure in a weld or fitting under the stress of operations. The event stands as one of the more serious documented reactor coolant incidents in the U.S. nuclear submarine program, a program otherwise famous for its safety record. It is remembered because it combined the 2 things submariners fear most: a hazard they could not see and a space they could not escape. This is exactly why crews drill relentlessly for what they call a reactor compartment casualty. In an event like this, the response time and how quickly the space is contained decide the dose each sailor takes. The U.S. Naval reactor program, built under Admiral Hyman Rickover, is famous for a safety record that has never suffered a reactor accident at sea on the scale of the Soviet losses. The Guardfish stands as a rare and sobering exception, proof that even the most careful program in the world can spring a radioactive leak in the middle of the ocean, and the Soviet fleet, as we will see, learned the same lesson far more violently. Number 3, the Soviet submarine K-429. There is a special kind of dread in a machine that fails not once, but twice. K-429 was a Charlie-class cruise missile submarine of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. On the 23rd of June, 1983, she was ordered out to a torpedo firing range in Serenaya Bay near Petropavlovsk. There was a serious problem hidden in her crew list. Nearly one-third of the roughly 120 men aboard had never served on this boat and had received no training on her systems. Her captain, Nikolai Suvorov, refused to skip a mandatory test dive, and that refusal would end up saving most of their lives. The boat was not properly aligned for sea. A ventilation opening had been left open. When she submerged, the forward compartments flooded almost instantly. Water surged in until about 420 tons had entered before the ventilation could be secured. In the panic, the sailor working the emergency ballast blow made a fatal mistake. He shut the valves that should have stayed open and opened the vents that should have stayed shut, doing the exact opposite of what was needed to force the water out. 14 men were killed almost at once. Some accounts put the total dead at 16. Around midnight, the boat came to rest on the bottom at only about 39 meters down. That shallow depth was the whole difference. The firing range she had been ordered toward was around 2,000 meters deep, far beyond any hope of escape or rescue. Because Suvorov insisted on that shallow test dive, survivors were able to escape through the torpedo tubes and escape trunks using rebreather sets. Dozens got out alive. For his trouble, Suvorov was court-martialed and imprisoned, even though his judgment had preserved the crew, and the boat's bad luck was not finished. K-429 was raised, returned to service, and then sank a second time in 1985 at her pier during repairs. The mainstream verdict is a collapse in training and readiness, a symptom of a late Soviet fleet stretched far beyond what its crews could safely manage. The escape itself was its own ordeal. Men filing into the torpedo tubes and escape trunks in the dark, breathing from rebreather sets, forcing themselves out into the cold water above a boat full of their drowned shipmates. But, at its core, a nuclear submarine was defeated by a single valve left in the wrong position, a reminder that hundreds of tons of ocean can pour through one modest opening in a matter of minutes. Number 4. HMS Tireless. Every submarine carries a backup way to make oxygen in case the main system fails. On HMS Tireless, that backup killed 2 of her crew. Tireless was a Trafalgar-class attack boat of the Royal Navy. In March of 2007, she was taking part in Ice Exercise 2007, operating beneath the Arctic ice cap near northern Alaska, alongside the U.S. Navy. On the 21st of March, an explosion tore through the forward escape compartment. 2 young submariners, leading operator mechanic Paul McCann and operator-maintainer Anthony Huntrod, were killed. A third was injured. The cause was a device called a self-contained oxygen generator, known as a SCOG, or an oxygen candle. It makes breathable oxygen by burning a chemical briquette, usually based on sodium chlorate and iron. It is the same basic technology used to supply emergency oxygen on airliners and spacecraft. The Board of Inquiry found that this particular briquette had been contaminated. When a briquette is contaminated, the chemical reaction can run away, building heat and pressure until the generator explodes. The crew had done nothing wrong. The board concluded the device had been activated entirely appropriately. It simply failed. After the blast, the submarine surfaced up through the Arctic ice, and the injured crewman was flown to a hospital in Anchorage. Think about the position they were in. Beneath the polar ice cap, there is no quick way to the surface. A boat cannot simply rise because a ceiling of solid ice stands between it and the sky. The device meant to keep the crew breathing had become a bomb, in the one environment where escape is hardest of all. The official cause is contamination of the briquette, most likely introduced during storage or handling. An oxygen-rich chemical fire is extraordinarily energetic and very hard to smother in a confined hull, because the reaction supplies its own oxidizer. Making it worse, the explosion happened in the forward escape compartment, the very space the crew would use to abandon the boat. After the accident, the Ministry of Defense investigated and changed the way these generators are stored, inspected, and handled across the fleet. It remains one of the submarine service's most painful peacetime losses, a reminder that even the systems designed to save your life carry their own quiet risk. Number 5. The U.S.S. Sargo. Oxygen keeps a crew alive, and it can also destroy their boat. The Sargo was a Skate-class nuclear submarine that had just made history returning from a transit of more than 6,000 miles under the Arctic ice earlier in 1960. On the 14th of June, 1960, she was docked at Pearl Harbor, preparing to host the King and Queen of Thailand the very next day. She was charging her oxygen tanks. The oxygen line ran into the boat through the hatch of the stern torpedo room. The line developed a leak and the oxygen ignited. This is the danger of pure oxygen. In an oxygen-rich environment, materials that would normally smolder instead burst into fierce flame, and things that do not usually burn at all suddenly do. The fire, fed by pressurized oxygen, shot flames estimated at more than 100 feet into the air through the hatch. 2 Mark 37 torpedo warheads in the stern room cooked off in what is called a low-order detonation, burning violently rather than fully exploding. The sailor tending the oxygen line, machinist's mate, 3rd Class James Smallwood, was killed. He was posthumously awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his actions. To fight a fire fed by oxygen inside a torpedo room full of warheads, the crew took an extreme step. They backed the submarine down and deliberately submerged her stern right there at the pier, flooding the burning compartment to drown the flames. Intentionally flooding part of your own boat is a last resort measure, the kind of decision made only when the alternative is worse. It very likely prevented a full warhead detonation and further deaths. The stern room was wrecked and Sargo went back into the shipyard for the rest of the summer. The cause is understood as a leak in the oxygen line that found an ignition source. Enriched oxygen lowers the energy needed to start a fire, and then accelerates the burning dramatically, which is why the flames climb so high so fast. The event is still studied in submarine damage control training as a lesson in oxygen handling and in how close a crew can come to a magazine detonation. Sargo had only just returned to Pearl Harbor that March after covering more than 6,000 miles beneath the Arctic ice. What stays with people is the image, a submarine that had just conquered the Arctic, nearly lost at its own pier to a routine task of topping off its air. Number 6, the U.S.S. Cochino. This story combines espionage, a polar gale, and the oldest chemical hazard in submarines. The Cochino was a Belau-class diesel-electric boat, and in August of 1949, she was on a secret mission. Sailing along the Kola Peninsula off Norway with her sister boat, the U.S.S. Tusk, trying to detect signs that the Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb. On the 25th of August, she ran into a violent polar storm. The huge seas slammed her snorkel and jolted the boat so hard that it helped trigger an electrical fault in her battery. That fault set off a fire and a battery explosion, which released hydrogen gas. This is the fundamental danger of the lead-acid batteries that power a diesel submarine underwater. As they operate, they give off hydrogen, and hydrogen in the wrong concentration is violently explosive. The crews of both submarines fought to save Cochino for about 14 hours in appalling weather. Then, on the 26th of August, a second battery explosion forced the order to abandon ship. The men carried out a dangerous transfer by rope across to the Tusk in mountainous seas before Cochino finally sank. Remarkably, every member of Cochino's own crew survived. The deaths came from elsewhere. A Bureau of Ships technician named Robert Fillo was killed, along with 6 sailors from the Tusk who were lost trying to save others. Because the mission was so sensitive, the loss was kept quiet at the time. It is now generally considered the first U.S. submarine lost in the Cold War era. The chain of events shows how the sea itself can reach inside a hull. A storm on the surface pounded the boat. That pounding helped spark an electrical fault. And the fault ignited a chemical hazard that submariners still manage on every diesel-electric boat today. Managing hydrogen through ventilation, agitation of the cells, and constant gas detection remains a core discipline of battery safety. The rope transfer of Cochino's crew to the Tusk, carried out in a mountainous polar sea while their boat burned beneath them, is remembered as a legendary feat of seamanship. It is worth sitting with the arithmetic. Cochino, commissioned only in 1945, was lost. yet every one of her own crew came home. The dead were a visiting technician and 6 sailors from the boat that rescued them. Number 7. The Soviet submarine K-431. A submarine reactor is at its most vulnerable not at sea, but when it is opened up for refueling, K-431 was an Echo 2 class cruise missile submarine of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. On the 10th of August 1985, she was being refueled at the Chejima Bay repair facility near Vladivostok. She carried 2 reactors, each rated at about 70 megawatts of thermal power, fueled with uranium enriched to roughly 20%. During the refueling, the reactor lid was seated incorrectly. To fix it, the lid had to be lifted again, but it was raised with the control rod still attached to it. Control rods are what absorb neutrons and hold the chain reaction in check. As the lid came up too far, it pulled those rods out of the core. According to most accounts, a jolt made it worse, perhaps a beam that dropped or the wake from a passing boat. With the rods withdrawn, the starboard reactor went prompt critical. In simple terms, the chain reaction became self-sustaining in an instant and released a surge of energy in a fraction of a second. The result was a thermal, or steam, explosion. 10 people were killed instantly. About 49 others suffered radiation injuries. The blast ruptured the submarine's pressure hull and its aft bulkhead, and it threw the roof of the refueling shack roughly 70 meters into the bay. A radioactive plume was released over the area. It is considered one of the worst accidents in the history of the Soviet nuclear fleet. Cleanup of Chajma Bay went on for years, and some contamination lingers to this day. Because of Soviet secrecy, the full story only emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The mechanism, an uncontrolled reactivity excursion, is the same family of event as the later Chernobyl disaster, at a smaller scale. Prompt criticality means the chain reaction becomes self-sustaining on prompt neutrons alone, dumping its energy in milliseconds, far too fast for any operator to stop. The contamination spread downwind across the nearby Duni Peninsula, and the recovery of the 10 dead at the shattered reactor was itself a hazardous task. K-431 never returned to service. And the root cause was heartbreakingly simple, a violation of the lifting procedure during a maintenance task, the kind of error that seems almost trivial until you understand what it unleashed. Number 8. The Soviet submarine K-19. If K-431 was a sudden explosion, K-19 was a slow radioactive strangulation. She was a hotel-class boat, the first nuclear ballistic missile submarine the Soviet Union ever built. On the 4th of July 1961, she was on exercises in the North Atlantic near southern Greenland when a major leak developed in her reactor's primary coolant system. Pressure in the aft reactor dropped to 0, and the coolant pumps failed. The blame later fell on a faulty weld in the coolant piping. With the coolant gone, the reactor temperature began climbing toward about 800 degrees Celsius, roughly 1,470 degrees Fahrenheit, heading toward a meltdown. Worse still, a separate earlier failure had knocked out the long-range radio, so the boat could not even call for help, and the reactor had no built-in backup cooling system. So, the crew built one by hand. 8 engineers went into the contaminated reactor compartment wearing only light suits and gas masks to weld together a makeshift cooling loop. The doses they absorbed were staggering, on the order of 50 to 60 sieverts for the worst exposed. All 8 died within days. The recorded times from exposure to death were about 6, 6, 6, 8, 9, 11, 16, and 19 days. Over the next 2 years, roughly 14 more crew members died from the effects of radiation, bringing the total to around 22 deaths. But the makeshift loop worked. It held the reactor together long enough to prevent a full meltdown and a possible explosion that could have killed everyone aboard. The captain, Nikolai Zateyev, had to manage not only the reactor but the fear spreading through the boat as contamination crept through the hull. The Soviet Navy later gave K-19 a grim nickname, Hiroshima. The radioactive steam and gas contaminated much of the submarine's interior, so that the danger followed the crew through the length of the boat. The design flaw, a reactor with no independent emergency cooling system, was a direct product of how quickly the boat had been rushed into service, and it was addressed in later Soviet designs. The disaster was so stark that it was later dramatized on film for audiences around the world, but the human cost had already been paid by 8 men who welded themselves to death to save their shipmates. and by the roughly 14 more who died in the years that followed. Number 9. The U.S.S. Chopper. Submariners sometimes call it the wild ride, a total loss of control that hurls a boat through the sea. The Chopper lived through one of the most extreme examples on record. She was a Below-class diesel submarine, and on the 11th of February, 1969, she was taking part in an anti-submarine warfare exercise off Cuba with the destroyer U.S.S. Hawkins. She was making between 7 and 9 knots at a depth of about 150 feet with a slight down angle when all of her electrical power tripped offline. On a diesel-electric boat submerged, electrical power is everything. It drives the propeller, the pumps, and above all the control surfaces that keep the boat level. With it gone, Chopper had no way to arrest her dive. Within seconds, the down angle steepened to about 45 degrees. Her bow passed 440 feet, and she began descending almost vertically toward the bottom. Her estimated bow depth reached about 1,011 feet, far beyond the depth she was ever designed to survive. The hull groaned under a pressure it was never rated for. Then buoyancy and emergency measures took hold, and the ride reversed. About 2 minutes after losing power, Chopper shot back up through the surface, nearly vertical. The entire forward section of the boat, all the way back to the aft edge of the sail, cleared the water before she crashed back down. Astonishingly, no one was killed. But the plunge and the violent rebound had inflicted extensive structural damage on the hull. She was decommissioned on the 15th of September 1969, judged not worth repairing. The cause traced back to the failure of her electrical system, which on a submerged diesel boat controls the planes, the pumps, and the propulsion all at once. Survivors described being hurled about the compartments as the deck pitched to angles no one is meant to stand on. Recovery came from blowing the ballast tanks and letting the boat's own buoyancy fight the dive, a race the crew barely won. A depth of about 1,011 feet is a remarkable survival for a hull of that vintage, well past the margins engineers build in. And the story endures because of the sheer numbers: a boat driven past 1,000 feet, then thrown bodily out of the sea with a crew that somehow lived to tell it. Number 10. The I.N.S. Sindhurakshak. A modern, quiet, capable submarine can still be destroyed in an instant by its own weapons. The Sindhurakshak was a Kilo-class diesel-electric boat of the Indian Navy, built in Russia and delivered in 1997. Kilo-class boats are so quiet they have earned the nickname Black Hole. On the 14th of August 2013, she was berthed at the Naval dockyard in Mumbai. In the early hours of the morning, a series of near-simultaneous explosions tore through her forward weapons compartment. 18 sailors aboard were killed, and the submarine sank right there at her berth. Investigations pointed to the possible ignition of her onboard armaments. A board of inquiry found that violations of standard operating procedures during weapon handling were the likely cause. The exact spark that set it off was never conclusively established, but human error in handling the weapons was blamed. The near-simultaneous nature of the blast suggested that stored ordnance had detonated in sympathy, one explosion triggering the next. This was not the boat's first fire. Back in February of 2010, a fire aboard had killed one sailor in an event linked to a battery and hydrogen. The 2013 blast was far worse, powerful enough to sink her at the pier and buckle her internal structure. The recovery of the bodies was slow and grim. The submarine was later salvaged and eventually scuttled at sea in 2017. Her commanding officer faced disciplinary proceedings. It remains the worst submarine disaster in Indian naval history. The Kilo-class boats are prized precisely because they are so quiet, but that quiet capability rides on top of a full load of torpedoes and missiles, and in port those weapons are handled, moved, and loaded by hand. Concentrating that much explosive power inside a sealed hull leaves almost no margin for a mistake. In the aftermath, the Indian Navy launched a broad review of its submarine safety procedures, and it repeats a pattern seen with the Sargo decades earlier. A boat sitting safely in port, handling the ordinary business of its weapons and supplies, when a single handling error turns the whole vessel into a tomb. Number 11. The U.S.S. Bonefish. In a sealed hull, it is often not the flame that kills, but the smoke. The Bonefish was a Barbell-class boat, one of the last conventional non-nuclear attack submarines the U.S. Navy operated. On the 24th of April 1988, she was running submerged during an exercise off the coast of Florida with the frigate U.S.S. Carr and the aircraft carrier U.S.S. John F. Kennedy nearby. Seawater began leaking onto cables and electrical buses, in a battery supply cableway. That was the trigger. Electrical arcing between the cables caused an explosion that flashed into a fire within minutes. Temperatures in the battery spaces reached about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Thick toxic smoke poured through the confined hull. Battery fires are especially cruel because a flooded or shorting battery can also give off chlorine and other poisonous gases on top of the smoke. The boat surfaced and the order came to abandon ship. 89 crew members were pulled to safety by whaleboats and helicopters from the Carr and the Kennedy, a rescue that saved almost the entire crew. But 3 men did not make it out. Lieutenant Ray Everts, Radioman First Class Robert Bordelon Jr., and Yeoman Third Class Marshal Lindgren all died of smoke inhalation. They were killed not by fire or by water, but by the air itself, turned poisonous in a space they could not clear. Bonefish was towed to Charleston, South Carolina, examined, and declared beyond repair. She was decommissioned and scrapped. Her loss effectively marked the end of the era of American conventional attack submarines. The Barbell class was an advanced design with a sleek teardrop hull that shaped the submarines that came after it, yet it carried the same fundamental battery risk as every boat before it. Survivors later described a hull so choked with smoke that they could see nothing, feeling their way toward escape while breathing from emergency air masks. The path that started it all, seawater finding its way into that battery supply cableway, became a focus of safety attention afterward. The failure began with something as simple as seawater reaching an energized electrical system, the same short-circuit to fire chain that has haunted battery-powered boats since the beginning. Number 12. The U.S.S. Squalus. Some malfunctions come down to a single valve that must close, and does not. The Squalus was a brand new fleet submarine running a test dive off the Isles of Shoals near New Hampshire. At 7:40 in the morning on the 23rd of May, 1939, during a rapid crash dive, her main engine air induction valve failed to seal. That valve guards a large opening in the hull that feeds air to the diesel engines. Before the boat submerges, it absolutely must close. It did not. Water gushed in through the opening and flooded the aft engine and crew compartments almost instantly, drowning 26 men. The partially flooded boat sank and came to rest keel down in about 240 feet of water. 33 survivors, 32 crew, and 1 civilian were trapped in the forward compartments. Their commanding officer, Oliver Naquin, kept order and released a marker buoy with a telephone so rescuers could make contact. What happened next changed submarine history. The rescue ship U.S.S. Falcon lowered a brand new device called the McCann Rescue Chamber, a kind of diving bell designed for exactly this nightmare. Over the 23rd to the 25th of May, all 33 survivors were brought to the surface alive. It was the first successful use of the McCann chamber and the first rescue of men from a sunken submarine at that kind of depth. Several rescuers, including Chief Machinist's mate William Batters, received the Medal of Honor. The story did not even end there. Squalus was salvaged and recommissioned under a new name, the U.S.S. Sailfish. During the World War II, she sank the Japanese escort carrier Chuyo, a strange kind of redemption for a boat that had begun her life at the bottom. The cause was a mechanical failure of the induction system, possibly worsened by a faulty indicator that told the crew the valve was shut when it was not. The endurance of the survivors is part of the legend, 33 men wading through a long, cold day in the forward compartments, the air slowly thickening with carbon dioxide, not knowing whether anyone could reach them. Their rescue drove a wave of improvements in submarine escape and rescue capability across the fleet. It is the archetype of the single valve failure, and it gave the world the modern art of submarine rescue. Step back from the individual disasters, and a pattern comes into focus. A submarine is a small, sealed volume surrounded by an ocean that wants to get in, and almost every one of these failures is really about that thin boundary. Reserve buoyancy, the margin that keeps a boat afloat, is surprisingly small. K429 took on about 420 tons of water and went to the bottom. Guitarro needed only a few tons in the wrong tanks. Depth makes flooding worse because water is driven in by pressure, and a leak at 400 feet floods far faster and more violently than the same leak near the surface. Fire is just as unforgiving. In a sealed atmosphere, a fire eats the oxygen the crew needs and fills every compartment with toxic smoke that cannot simply be vented, as the men on the Bonefish and the Tireless discovered, and the boat carries its own dangers inside the hull. battery hydrogen and chlorine, chemical oxygen candles, liquid oxygen lines, live warheads, and radioactive reactor coolant are all packed into one narrow steel tube. There is no outside to run to. Sometimes the surface itself is blocked by a ceiling of Arctic ice or by thousands of feet of water below. Even holding a steady depth depends on power, planes, and trim all working together. Lose any one of them, as the chopper did, and the same ocean that supports the boat can swallow it in seconds. Consider the numbers behind that pressure. At the surface, a hull feels roughly 15 pounds on every square inch. By 600 feet, it is carrying close to 300 pounds per square inch, pressing on every seam, every valve, and every joint at once. A pipe that leaks harmlessly in dock becomes a knife-edge jet at depth, capable of cutting through a compartment and filling it faster than any pump can keep up. That is why submariners treat even a weeping fitting as a serious casualty. The margins that separate a routine dive from a disaster are measured in tons of water, in degrees of angle, and in the few minutes a crew has to react before the physics becomes irreversible. There is a second pattern, and it is about people. Very few of these disasters were caused by a broken part alone. Almost everyone was a hardware fault tangled together with a human error. On the Guitarro and K429, nothing important actually broke. The boats were undone by coordination and configuration, by crews who did not talk to each other, or systems left in the wrong state. On K431 and the Sindhurakshak, the disaster grew out of the handling of the most dangerous things aboard, a reactor and a magazine of weapons, during routine procedures that went wrong. And once a casualty begins, confusion can make it far worse, as it did when K429's emergency operator reversed the very valves that could have saved the boat. The flip side of that human element is courage. Again and again, the response to catastrophe was some extreme act of damage control. The Sargo's crew deliberately flooded their own stern to kill a fire. K-19's engineers welded a cooling loop by hand inside a reactor that was killing them. It is worth noticing that in most of these stories, the majority of the crew survived. The tragedy is usually measured in a handful of names, not in an entire lost company, precisely because trained people fought back against the machine. On the Guitarro, workers scrambled to dog hatches against the rising water. On the Squalus, 33 men held themselves together through a long day on the bottom until rescue arrived. On the Cochino, 2 crews battled a burning boat for 14 hours before a single one of them left. Training is what turns a catastrophe into a survivable emergency. It is also why the same failure can produce wildly different outcomes, with one boat lost to the seabed and another limping home, depending entirely on how the people aboard respond in the first crucial minutes. So, what came of all this? A great deal, as it turns out. The loss of the Squalus gave the world the McCann rescue chamber and the foundations of modern submarine escape and rescue. The reactor disasters aboard K-19, K-431, and the Guardfish drove real changes in backup cooling and in the safety of refueling procedures. The way oxygen candles are handled was rethought after the Tireless, and the monitoring of battery spaces tightened after the Bonefish and the Cochino. Today's submarines carry better atmosphere sensors, better gas detection, and far more refined casualty procedures than the boats in these stories ever had. And yet the fundamental situation has not changed at all. A modern submarine still carries batteries, oxygen, weapons, and often a nuclear reactor, all sealed inside a single thin hull, deep beneath a crushing weight of water. Every hazard in this video still exists, in principle, on the next boat to slip beneath the waves. The reactor still needs its coolant. The battery still gives off its hydrogen. The oxygen that keeps the crew alive is still one leak away from a fire, and the weapons in the forward room are still handled by human hands. Modern sensors and procedures have made these events rarer, but they have not made them impossible, because the underlying design has not changed. A submarine is still a sealed can of dangerous energy, sent on purpose into the most hostile environment on the planet. That is why these failures keep naval operators up at night. Not because they belong to the past, but because every one of them describes something that could, under the wrong circumstances, happen again.